So with long exposure stuff, I think people make the whole long exposure thing a little more convoluted than it actually is, and a lot of times, they get hung up. You got your camera now has a lens on it, which now has some type of filter on the front, whether that's a square filter with an adapter, or it's a circular filter that screws in. And anytime you add bits and parts and pieces to your workflow, whether that's on scene or in post processing, things get convoluted at first. Okay, so there's this learning curve of what am I supposed to do now that I've got all this stuff? So these 5 tips will kind of just help you in the field when you're shooting those long exposure images. And they're pretty simple. They aren't anything out of the ordinary or too extreme. But some of them might make you think a little bit, because you might not be thinking about them while you're on the scene and shooting. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up my little cheat sheet over here on the other side of my screen so I can read them. My first big tip for you is to ensure that you have a working way to take your exposures. So you should have some way that you can take the pictures without touching the shutter. So you don't want to touch the shutter, because if you touch the shutter, you're going to incur some shake, and even a little bit of shake in the very beginning of your exposure could throw off the entire long exposure. So you should have a shutter release of some sort. And this might sound a little like a tip number 1 is a really simple tip, but it's a really important tip, and I'll give you 2 reasons why. And the first reason why is that I have a shutter release. And if you look at my tripod now, all of my tripods, I bought an extra one of these $7.88 tripod or shutter releases, and I have them Velcroed in 2 spots on my tripod at all times, so that I always have one with me. I have one on my travel tripod. I have one on my big tripod that you see over here. There's one on there. There's 2 extra ones in my bag. There's 2 because one of them is a time-lapse one, and the other one is a regular one, just like that. So I always have multiple ways of using my shutter. I also have my cell phone, so I can actually use my cell phone to control my shutter also. And then I also have an IR remote that looks like this. It's just a little teeny tiny little IR remote. So I always have a backup to my backup to my backup's backup's backup. So it's like the distant cousins of the shutter release. And I say this for 2 reasons. The first one is that one time I changed all my stuff over from one camera bag to another one, and I went out to shoot some long exposure stuff, and when I changed one bag to the other, I forgot to put a shutter release in there. It's kind of like when my wife has 2 purses, or 15 purses, however many purses she has, and one of them, she needs to change so it matches her outfit better, and she moves all the stuff over and she forgets her chapstick, then I have to reach in my pocket and give her chapstick all night. So it's kind of like that. So the reason why is that you might forget it in the process of changing over your camera bags. And the second reason is that there was someone on one of our workshops, very good photographer. She had a Cam Ranger, and the Cam Ranger is you can control your camera from your iPod or iPad or whatever device you want to control it from, and it basically Bluetooths into a device that's onto your camera, and from there you can see all the stuff on the display, which is great, because if you've got a nice big iPod or iPad, you're seeing all of the stuff that's on the back of your sensor, and it's phenomenal. You can zoom in a really far away, and you can dial down your focus really well. Well, in the process of using her Cam Ranger, something happened and the camera dropped or something like that, and it almost rendered her unable to use that. So it would have been good for her to have a backup of some sort. So, like I say, backup to a backup to a backup to a backup to a backup. And that's a critical one. Okay, so always make sure you have a backup of some sort. The next thing that I want to talk about when it comes to this is the actual exposure time. What's the actual exposure time that you use when you're shooting your long exposure images? And here's where you have your neutral density calculators. Like I have an ND calculator on my phone, which says, okay, if you're at ISO 100 at f8 and you have a 10-stop ND filter on and your initial shutter was this, then this is what you should be at, and it tells me what my calculation is for a 10-stop ND filter. And that's great, but think of these calculators as an estimate. They don't give you exactly what it's going to be. So estimate your calculation for your 10-stop ND filter on your phone. There's another thing I have in my bag, which is actually a printout, an Excel spreadsheet printout that has, I can move my finger around and see what my shutter needs to be based off of the filter calculation. But it doesn't stop there. So with the length of your exposure, you want to calculate it, then take the exposure. And the beauty of living in the age that we're in, the digital age that we're in, you can always look at the back of that LCD screen and say, oh, okay, well, that's a little bit too dark or that's a little bit too bright. Well, instead of recalculating or getting yourself stuck in this, okay, my calculator just told me this time and that time is entirely too dark. What do I do? Well, just think of the law of exposure and stops, okay? A stop of light is a double the amount of light or half the amount of light. So if you need, if your image is too dark, you want to double the amount of light to get it brighter, okay? If your image is too light, you need to half the amount of light. So let's say your ND calculator says, okay, you've got a 10-stop ND filter, you're at ISO 100, you've got your aperture at f8, and your shutter should be 6 seconds long. And you click, 6 seconds goes by, and your image is entirely too dark. Well, just go to 12 seconds. And then if it's still too dark, go to maybe 24 seconds. And then if that's too dark, or if that becomes too light, then go halfway between. So instead of going to maybe 24 seconds, you go to 18 seconds. So you always do things in laws of halves, okay? And that's basically how I make all my exposures, because I guarantee you the ND calculator is not going to calculate my exposure exactly how I need it to be exposed for. And then instead of getting stuck in that mode of, what do? Just double the amount of light or half the amount of light, and that will get you where you need to be. The next good tip here is along the lines of the length of your exposure. So you've got your exposure. What exactly are you exposing for? Well, typically in this world of long exposure photography, what are we shooting? Well, we're shooting maybe waterfalls, clouds, moving water, things that typically have quite a bit of highlights in them. So what we actually need to expose for are the highlights in the scene. So if you're doing your calculations and you expose your image and it's too dark and you double the amount of exposure and then it goes to maybe 24 seconds, we'll use that example, and at 24 seconds you look at the back of your screen and the water for the waterfall looks all like white. Turn on that in your camera. There's this thing called highlight warnings or something like that. I call them the blinkies, because basically you turn on your LCD screen and you see the back of your camera going blink, blink, blink. Like, it doesn't actually make that noise, but it makes that noise in my head. Those are the blinkies that come on that say, okay, hey, this area is overexposed. Extremely overexposed. Well, if that area that's extremely overexposed is your focal point, then that's what you want to be basing your entire exposure off of. So if that blinky thing is the clouds that are sweeping by or the water that's going by, think about that and say, okay, we need to maybe half the amount of exposure and not let as much light in so that those blinkies aren't going so blinky, okay? Along that line, so we talked about number one, always have a shutter release, or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. Okay, that's tip number one. Tip number two is the length of exposure. So even if you have an ND calculator, make sure that your exposure is right. And you can do that by doubling the amount of light if it's too dark or halving the amount of light if it's too light. And then number three, expose for the highlights. And now we need to talk about what we're actually capturing, okay? So while you're on scene and you're shooting these waterfalls, you're shooting these clouds, it doesn't matter what you're shooting. You want to capture the personality of your subject, okay? And that might sound crazy, but think about this. In portrait photography, I just got a headshot done the other day, about a month ago. And this individual, I showed up, and the first thing he does not say, okay, stand there, let me take your picture. He says, hey, Blake, how are you? My name is so-and-so. I'm going to be taking your shot today. So what do you like to do? Do you have any family? Do you have a wife? Do you have kids? What do you do? And I told him, what I did and who I was and my wife, my kids. I told him all about my family and everything. He was making me more comfortable with him. And he was also learning about me so that he could better capture my personality. And you might think that it's crazy to think about a landscape scene the same you would think about portraiture, but you have to, because as landscape photographers, we're capturing the personality of the scene. Okay. A lot of times when someone has an unsuccessful landscape photograph, it's because they didn't capture the personality so well. It would be like if a portrait photographer went and showed up and did my headshot and they all came out like this. I see some landscape pictures like that where you're just like, really, you didn't really capture the personality successful for this scene. And I have a visual demonstration for this when it comes to capturing the personality of your long exposure images. And in this waterfall scene, you're going to see that this was the actual waterfall. So I took a picture of this waterfall at 1/80th of a second to show what the waterfall was. How fast was the water moving? What was the personality of the water at that time? Okay. And then I said, okay, well, let me see what happens if we go at 1/2 of a second instead of the typical 1/80th of a second. So here is the actual waterfall. Here is the waterfall at 1/2 of a second, and here's the waterfall at about 6 seconds. So look at the differences in all of these images. In this one, we see a snapshot of the rapid waterfall flying towards us. In this one, right here at the 1/2 second, we see more of these little lines and textures that are happening inside the waterfall. And then this one, we see it at 6 seconds, and everything turns into like this misty, almost looks like just straight white marshmallows falling down a waterfall. So when it comes to the personality of a waterfall, this is an artistic expression. For me, I don't necessarily like this one right here because it's too mushy. It doesn't exactly show the personality of the waterfall. This one is just ugly and looks like a snapshot of a waterfall. But this one actually shows a little bit. If we zoom in here, we get real deep in here, you can see that we don't have blown out areas like we do in, say, this one. We still have some of the texture of the water moving, and we can actually see every little bit of water throughout this waterfall moving, whereas this one, things get kind of muddy and we lose some of that fast, rapid motion. So in this one, we're capturing the rapid motion, but we're also capturing the how fast the waterfall is, okay? And every waterfall is going to be different, and every stream is going to be different. So at 1/2 a second, this is showing a lot of movement at 1/2 a second. But if you were, say, at a lake or something, and you shot 1/2 a second at a lake with still moving water, it's not going to create that smooth reflection. You're going to need to go more like 30 seconds or something like that. But let's say you do like this. Let's say this is something that you like. You actually enjoy this one here. I want you to think about taking both of these exposures, maybe using the best of both worlds. So if what we could do here is we could actually take this 1/2 a second one, and we could take a mask on this 1/2 a second one, and let's just turn that mask black by pressing Control I. So what that did is that basically said everything in this mask is black, and nothing from this image is showing up. But if I make my brush about the size of what I want to brush in, and I use my Wacom tablet here with some pressure sensitivity, I can start to brush in with white some of those areas where I want that texture to come back. And, while we do have that kind of misty, almost marshmallow type of effect going on, we can start to paint in some areas where we want the other part of that to come back. So we have that personality, but we still have that nice mysticism of that white area coming through here, and we can just paint out all this. I definitely want to paint all this back in pretty hard back here. So if we look at our mask here, press Alt or Option on our mask, this is exactly what we did. We didn't paint too hard down here. We actually have some of that white area underneath coming through. But now you can see that we have the best of both worlds. We have that white, mysterious mysticism going on, but then we also have the personality of that scene going on. And that's really important to capture those things. So my last and final tip before we move too far into the questions, and I'm getting overwhelmed here with all the people here, I'm going to move into the pre-visualization mode. So I want you to think about things while you're on the scene. And, the greatest photographers that lived before us always told us things about pre-visualization. Like, when you're on the scene, what are you going to do with it afterward? And if you're on the scene and you're not at that point yet where you're thinking about what you're going to do after, then you're not quite where you need to be yet. Okay, so think about, what I want you to think about is when you go onto a scene, think more about what you're going to do in the end. Because if you're just thinking about what you're doing while you're there, you're not setting yourself up for success when you actually can make the most effectiveness on your images. So the time that we can be most effective is at during the post-processing phase, where we can actually make the image what we want it to be. Now, I always tell people, they say, okay, so when you're taking your pictures, how much of it actually happens in camera? Well, for me, I'd say about 5% of what I do happens in camera. And you might think that's crazy. Only 5% of taking pictures happens in the camera. And yes, because I'm not taking pictures, I'm making pictures, but that's neither here nor there. When you're first starting out, though, it's the opposite. It's the opposite. So if you're a beginner photographer, 95% of what you do is going to be in camera. 5% is going to be what happens after. And then as you slowly progress, you're going to see it kind of go like this. And then it's going to be a 50-50, where you're spending a lot of time in camera, a lot of time post-processing. And then it's going to go like this, where you're spending less time in the camera, more time post-processing, to the point that you already know what you want to shoot in the very beginning of it, so that when you're in the post-processing phase, you've got 95% of all of the stuff that you need to get done happening in the post-processing phase. And you're building a efficient workflow to do this. So I want you to think about the pre-visualization of things when you're actually on the scene, okay? So I have another demonstration here for you for this one. So I'll show my screen, and we're going to go into this example. So what I do when I go on the scene is I take a bracketed series of exposures for all of my images. This was actually in the Blue Mountains of Georgia about 2 years ago. If you saw the course Exploring HDR, the video series, I was actually standing on some rocks right here while my wife was doing some video of me getting really excited about this shot. But when you're there and you're looking at this, it's not very exciting. You know, we had a lot of color actually happening in the trees because it was fall and some of the leaves were falling. But look at the water. I mean, it's just not that great. But I took a bracketed series of exposures so that I could do an HDR image. Okay. So I take a series of bracketed images, clack, 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 dark, right exposure, bright exposure, okay? And then I make a long exposure, and that long exposure is specifically for the water, okay? So I'm exposing just for the water. I don't care about what happens in the rest of the image. Then what I do in post-processing, see, I'm pre-visualizing. I'm saying, okay, Blake, you're on the scene. You need a bracket of the scene for documentation purposes. After you've taken the documentation images, let's jump into the long exposure and see what you can pull from the long exposure. And then let's do something in Photoshop where we blend them. So what you see in the background here is an HDR image that's been merged in tone mapping to take all the detail and color and get that out there. And then I blended it, painted it in, just like you saw in the last image. So I paint in all that water to get that water back. And then I can further post-process it and get it to where my vision is. This was my vision when I was there. This is what I actually saw while I was on the scene. But my vision said, you know what? There's a lot of cool stuff going on in here that looks much better than this. Let's extract it. Let's bring it out. Let's do it in post-processing. But you can't do that in post-processing until you get the information that you need while you're on the scene. So it's critically important that while you're there, don't fumble with it. Don't say, okay, I'm just going to do a long exposure because I don't feel like bracketing, or I'm just going to bracket because I don't feel like doing a long exposure. I don't care what you feel like doing. It's just like going to the gym. I don't want to do it every single day, but when I do, I feel good about it when I'm done. And the same thing's going to happen when you're out there taking your long exposure images. If you don't feel like putting your filter on, then you're going to miss out. If you don't feel like taking the brackets, then you're not going to get this image. And I can tell you that 100%. It's just not going to happen. Okay. So there are my tips, my 5 practical tips, practical application tips for you in, while you're on scene shooting your long exposure images. Number 1. Make sure that you have 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe even 5 ways to shut off your shutter release without touching it. So that could be a shutter release, a backup shutter release, a cell phone, an IR remote, or some other way of taking your exposure. I know Sony has this app on the Sony cameras where you can actually wave your hand in front of the little eyepiece that's on the Sonys, and that can be a way that you can take a picture too. So there's many different ways that you can take a picture without even touching your camera, completely hands off. The second tip that we had there was the length of exposure. Make sure that the exposure that you're taking you calculate for, because it's important to get that calculation, but if it's too dark, You want to double the amount of light to get more light in. If it's too light, you want to half the amount of light to get less light in your sensor. Now, expose for the highlights. When you're doing that exposure, make sure that you expose for those highlights, because typically we're shooting these waterfalls and we're shooting these clouds, and they are highlights in their nature because they're white. So make sure that you're exposed for those highlights and turn those highlight blinkies on in your camera during playback. And then the fourth thing was capture the personality of your subject. You want to make sure that if you're shooting a waterfall, it doesn't get too milky and hazy, that you still have some of that texture there. And that might actually be one of those things that you call an artistic expression versus a technical flaw, and that's up to you 100%. But I would suggest getting some of the texture back in there so that your waterfall doesn't look like molten lava, okay? And clouds are the same way. They actually look best with a little bit of those like spurts of movement, that spurts of line work in there. And then I want you to think in terms of layers, so that while you're there, you can maybe shoot the pre-visualization is to shoot with your HDR bracketed series, and then shoot for your long exposure image and blend them together, because that's going to be where you can really get your vision and take it to that complete next level, and it's just awesome. What I've done is recently I've put together a course on long exposure. This is my long exposure workflow with ND filters, the entire long exposure workflow with ND filters that I have. It's over on our website called F64 Elite. If you're an F64 Elite member, you can stream this right now. Actually, at 10 o'clock, an email just went out to all of the F64 Elite members saying, hey, this 2 hours of long exposure course is now available for you. There's follow along images, there's practices images in there, there's 50 pages of documentation, there's a print ND filter calculator chart, everything. All of that stuff is in this course. And there's two ways to watch it now. If you're not an F64 Elite member, you can purchase the course. So it's a really awesome deal for those who are actually F64 Elite members, but the option is there that if you want to download it and not become a member, I completely understand. That option is available for you also. It goes over everything. The equipment that you need from the very beginning. It goes over shooting, how to shoot for a long exposure image, and then it goes into 3 different types of workflows after showing you how to blend those exposures together. So I did everything really fast here, like rapid fire, because I wanted to give you some really good tips and tricks on your long exposure images. But really, when it comes down to it, the whole course there, it's 2 hours of just straight education, and it's pretty cool. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to watch this. I appreciate it.